Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The wind howled through the ancient stone walls of Camelot, carrying with it the scent of coming doom. Arthur sat on his throne, his brow furrowed, his fingers tapping absently on the cold armrest. Though the fires in the hall burned bright, casting a golden glow over the banners of his kingdom, the chill of unease could not be shaken. Reports had been trickling in for days now of villages ravaged, towns reduced to rubble, and no survivors to tell the tale. It was as if death itself had risen from the earth to claim what was his. Merlin entered silently, his robes flowing like mist as he moved closer to Arthur. His face, always wise and serene, now carried a shadow that had never been there before. "They're coming," Merlin said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, though it filled the hall. Arthur's hand stilled, and he looked up at his old friend, eyes filled with unspoken questions. "What do you mean? Who is coming?" "The Knights of Fate," Merlin replied, his gaze distant. "Morgana has summoned them from the depths of the underworld. They are undead warriors, cursed to serve her will, and they cannot be killed by mortal weapons." Arthur leaned forward, gripping the armrests of his throne so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What power could grant her such control over death itself? Black magic, forbidden even among the darkest of sorcerers. Morgana's hate for you has driven her to lengths we cannot imagine. She seeks to destroy Camelot, to see it burn under the feet of those cursed knights. Arthur stood abruptly, his armor clinking softly as he did. "Then we will meet them on the field of battle. We've faced dark forces before, Merlin. We will not fall to this threat." Merlin shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, Arthur. These knights they cannot be killed. Not by any weapon forged by man." A cold silence fell between them, Arthur's mind reeling. "Then what can defeat them?" Merlin stepped closer, his eyes locking with Arthur's. "There is an artifact, an ancient sword, forged long ago in the same fires as Excalibur, by a sorcerer even more powerful than me. It is the only weapon capable of undoing the magic that binds the Knights of Fate. But it has been lost for centuries." Arthur's voice was a low growl. "And how do we find this weapon in time to stop Morgana?" "We must go on a quest," Merlin said, his voice firm but burdened. "A journey fraught with danger and challenges beyond what you've faced before. You must find this sword, Arthur, if you are to save Camelot." For a moment, Arthur's confidence faltered, the weight of the crown on his head seemed heavier than ever. "And what if I fail?" Merlin's expression softened. "If you fail, then Camelot will fall." "But you will not fail, Arthur. You were born to lead, and destiny has chosen you to rise in the darkest of times." Arthur closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the expectations of every knight, every villager, every soul in Camelot pressing down on him. They believed in him, believed in his strength, his courage, his leadership. And yet, doubt gnawed at his heart. Could he truly save his people? "Gather the knights," Arthur finally said, his voice steady, though inside he felt anything but. "We ride at dawn." The next morning, the sun rose behind a veil of clouds, casting an eerie gray light over the land. Arthur, dressed in his battle-worn armor, stood at the gates of Camelot, watching as his most trusted knights assembled before him. Sir Lancelot, ever the loyal friend, rode up beside him, his expression hard but resolute. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" Lancelot asked quietly. "A quest to find a weapon that may not even exist. We could be riding to our deaths." Arthur glanced at him, grateful for Lancelot's honesty. "If we stay here and do nothing, we face certain death. I'd rather take my chances with destiny than wait for Morgana's knights to overrun Camelot." Lancelot nodded, his grip tightening on the reins of his horse. "Then I'm with you, as always." Merlin rode upon Arthur's other side, his staff resting across his lap. "We must make haste. The Knights of Fate are already on the move. Time is not on our side." With a final glance at the towering walls of Camelot, Arthur gave the order, and they rode out, the sound of hooves thundering against the ground as they left the safety of their kingdom behind. The journey was long and grueling. They rode through forests darkened by ancient trees, where the air seemed thick with unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. They crossed treacherous mountains, where the biting wind threatened to knock them from their saddles. But through it all, Arthur led them with unwavering determination, though doubt continued to plague him. Each night as they camped, Arthur found himself lying awake, staring up at the stars. He wondered what kind of king he truly was. Could he lead his people through this? Was he deserving of the faith they had placed in him? And worse still, could he face Morgana his sister, his blood, and knowing that she would stop at nothing to destroy everything he had built? Merlin, sensing Arthur's unrest, often stayed awake with him. The old wizard would sit beside the fire, speaking of the ancient tales and prophecies that had foretold of this moment. "Do you ever doubt, Merlin?" Arthur asked one night, his voice soft in the darkness. Merlin looked at him with eyes that had seen more than most men could fathom. "Every man who walks the path of destiny doubts, Arthur. But it is not the doubt that defines us, it is how we overcome it. You were born to be king. It is in your blood, and no amount of doubt can change that." Arthur stared into the flames, Merlin's words lingering in his mind. He wanted to believe that, to embrace the destiny laid out for him, but each passing day seemed to bring more uncertainty. Days turned into weeks as the group pressed onward, following the ancient maps Merlin had unearthed. The further they traveled, the more dangerous their path became. They encountered fierce storms, wild beasts, and treacherous terrain that tested their limits. One evening, as they neared the edge of a vast desert, Morgana's magic struck. Arthur had just settled into camp when a dark mist began to roll in, swirling around the edges of their campfire. His knights immediately drew their swords, but Merlin waved them down. "It's her," Merlin said, his voice heavy with dread. "Morgana is reaching out from afar, trying to sway you." The mist thickened, and suddenly Arthur heard her voice, Morgana's voice, whispering in the wind. "Brother," a broken bar, her voice cooed, sweet and sinister. "Why do you fight this? Surrender to me, and I will spare you." "Come home, Arthur." "Camelot could be ours, Sir Broken Bar." Arthur clenched his fists, fighting the temptation that her words stirred within him. He knew it was a lie, a manipulation, but the doubts in his heart made it harder to resist. What if surrendering truly spared his people? What if fighting only brought more suffering? He gritted his teeth, shaking his head. "No," he whispered, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I will not yield to you, Morgana." "Camelot will stand." The mist swirled more violently, and Morgana's voice turned cold and harsh. "Then you will die, Arthur, and your precious kingdom will burn." In an instant, the mist evaporated, leaving only the crackling of the campfire and the uneasy silence of the nights. Arthur's heart raced in his chest, but he stood firm, his gaze steely. "We press on at first light." The following day, they entered the desert, their journey becoming even more perilous. The heat bore down on them relentlessly, and the endless sands seemed to stretch on forever. But Arthur pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that the artifact Excalibur's Twino was their only hope. As they neared the heart of the desert, a sudden sandstorm swept over them, its ferocity unlike anything they had ever encountered. The wind howled, the sand cutting into their skin like blades. They could barely see a few feet ahead, and the storm threatened to scatter them. But Merlin, ever the guide, raised his staff, casting a protective barrier around the group. "We're close," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "The artifact is near." Arthur's heart pounded with renewed hope. Despite the storm's fury, they pressed on, knowing that they were nearing the end of their journey. As the storm began to subside, they came upon a massive stone structure half buried in the sand. Its surface was worn and cracked, but there was no mistaking it. This was the resting place of Excalibur's twin, the ancient sword that could save Camelot. Arthur dismounted, his hand trembling slightly as he approached the entrance. This was it, the key to their victory or perhaps their final defeat. Either way, There was no turning back now. Lost to the ages, finding it will be no small feat. Arthur's eyes burned with determination. Where do we start? The sword is said to be hidden in the Obsidian Mountains, beyond the realm of our maps. It rests in a forgotten temple guarded by powerful enchantments. Few have ventured there and even fewer have returned. Arthur's jaw tightened. Then that is where we shall go. The following morning, Arthur, Merlin, Sir Lancelot, and Sir Gawain set out on their quest. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, a stark contrast to the darkness that loomed. The group traveled through dense forests and over rugged hills, the journey already proving arduous. The knights rode with grim faces, each step taking them further into an unknown that promised only danger. As they advanced, the weather grew colder, and the landscape began to change. Snow-capped peaks loomed in the distance, their icy presence a reminder of the trials ahead. The journey was grueling, but the thought of Camelot's impending destruction drove them forward. Nightfall brought its own set of challenges. The group set up camp in a sheltered valley, and the fire crackled warmly, a beacon against the encroaching cold. As the knights sat around the fire, Arthur's thoughts were troubled. The reports of the Knights of Fate's relentless advance weighed heavily on him, and he could not shake the sense of dread that had settled in his chest. His confidence, once unwavering, had been shaken by the realization of the power his enemies wielded. Merlin, noticing Arthur's unease, approached him as the others spoke quietly among themselves. "You doubt yourself, Arthur." Arthur looked up, his face set in a troubled frown. "I fear I am not the leader my people need. These knights and no man, no matter how brave, can stand against them without the proper means." Merlin placed a reassuring hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Even the greatest leaders have their moments of doubt. What defines you is not the absence of fear but your ability to confront it. Remember why you began this journey, not for glory, but for the people of you swore to protect." Arthur nodded, though the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. "I will do whatever it takes to save Camelot." The next morning, the group continued their journey, the towering peaks of the Obsidian Mountains growing ever closer. As they reached the base of the mountains, the terrain became more treacherous. Jagged rocks and icy paths made progress slow and dangerous. The cold was unrelenting, seeping into their bones, but they pressed on, driven by the urgency of their mission. The ancient temple, hidden deep within the mountains, was said to be protected by ancient magic. As the group neared their destination, the landscape grew more forbidding. The air was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the snow. Eventually, they arrived at a cavern entrance, partially obscured by a cascade of ice. The entrance was guarded by intricate runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. Merlin examined the runes with a frown, his knowledge of ancient magic allowing him to recognize their significance. "This is a powerful ward," Merlin said, tracing the symbols with his fingers. "It is designed to repel those who seek the artifact without rightful claim." Arthur stepped forward, determination etched into his features. "How do we bypass it?" Merlin closed his eyes, concentrating. "The runes require a key, a gesture of true resolve. Only someone who embodies the spirit of a true leader can pass through." Arthur took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He reached out and touched the runes, focusing on the purpose that drove him. The runes glowed brighter, and a warm energy seemed to pulse from the stones. With a low rumble, the entrance to the cavern began to open, revealing a dark passage beyond. The group entered the cavern, their path illuminated by the glow of Merlin's staff. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and age-old dust. The cavern walls were adorned with ancient carvings, telling the tale of the sword's creation and its purpose. The deeper they ventured, the more the sense of ancient power seemed to envelop them. After what felt like hours of navigating the twisting passages, they reached a grand chamber. At its center stood a pedestal, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. The artifact, the ancient sword, lay atop it, its hilt glimmering with a light that seemed almost alive. Arthur approached the pedestal cautiously, his eyes never leaving the sword. As he reached out to take it, A sudden chill filled the chamber. The air crackled with dark energy, and from the shadows emerged a formidable figure, the guardian of the sword, an ancient spirit bound to protect it from unworthy hands. The spirit's eyes glowed with a cold, blue fire, and it spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "Who dares to claim the sword of the ancients?" Arthur stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I am Arthur, King of Camelot. I seek this sword to save my kingdom from destruction. I am willing to face whatever trials are necessary to prove my worth." The guardian regarded Arthur with a piercing gaze. "The sword's power can only be wielded by one who has proven his resolve. You must face a trial that will test your heart, your strength, and your spirit." Without another word, the guardian raised its hand, and the chamber transformed. The walls shifted, revealing a labyrinth of illusions and challenges. Arthur, Merlin, and the knights found themselves separated, each facing their own trials. Arthur's trial was a vision of his deepest fears and doubts. He found himself standing alone in the ruins of Camelot, the kingdom he had sworn to protect, now a smoldering wreck. His people cried out for help, their faces twisted in anguish. Arthur's heart ached, and he felt a crushing sense of failure. But as the vision intensified, he remembered Merlin's words and the reasons he had chosen this path. He clenched his fists and forced himself to face the illusions, fighting through the sorrow and despair. He realized that the true challenge was not the external trials, but the battle within himself. With newfound resolve, Arthur overcame the illusions. The vision faded, and he found himself back in the grand chamber, the guardian waiting with an inscrutable expression. "You have faced your trial and proven your worth," the guardian said. "The sword of the ancients is yours." Arthur approached the pedestal once more, his hand steady as he took the sword. The moment his fingers wrapped around the hilt, a surge of power flowed through him. He felt a renewed sense of strength and purpose. The group reunited and prepared to leave the cavern, their path clear. As they emerged into the daylight, the weight of the sword in Arthur's hand seemed to imbue him with a sense of hope and determination. The journey ahead was still fraught with peril, but they now had the means to confront their enemies. The group made their way back to Camelot, their spirits bolstered by their success. Yet, the looming threat of Morgana and the Knights of Fate remained. The sword was a powerful tool, but the true test lay ahead in the final confrontation. As they approached the kingdom, Arthur felt a profound sense of purpose. He knew that the path to victory would not be easy, but he was ready to lead his people against the encroaching darkness. The fate of Camelot rested on his shoulders, and with the sword of the ancients, he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The terrain became increasingly treacherous. The path narrowed and twisted, snaking up the mountainside with sheer drops on either side. The weather grew colder, and the air thin, making every step a laborious effort. Snow began to fall, blanketing the path in a layer of white, obscuring the rocks and making it easy to slip. Arthur's breath came in visible puffs, each exhale mingling with the frost in the air. The group trudged on, their faces set with grim determination. The mountains seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each turn revealing only more of the same dawning ascent. Merlin led the way, his staff glowing softly to illuminate the darkening path. Occasionally, he would stop and consult an old, worn map, its edges frayed and curling. Despite the map's age, Merlin's knowledge of its contents seemed almost instinctual. Hours passed, and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep blue hue over the snow-covered mountains. The group set up camp once more, their fire a small, comforting glow against the overwhelming darkness. As they gathered around the fire, the cold seeped into their bones, and the weight of their quest seemed to settle heavily upon them. Arthur sat apart from the others, staring into the flames. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on his face, highlighting the lines of worry etched into his features. Lancelot and Gawain, sensing their leader's distress, approached him with quiet concern. "Arthur," Lancelot said softly, "we are with you. Whatever trials lie ahead, we face them together." Arthur looked up, Meeting Lancelot's steady gaze. "I fear that my doubts might lead us to failure. If we cannot find this artifact, all our efforts will have been for naught." Gawain stepped forward, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "We are stronger than any dark force, and we have each other. Remember that." The words were meant to comfort, and they did offer some solace, but the weight of their mission was still a heavy burden. Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will find the artifact. We have no other choice." The next day, the ascent continued, each step taking them further into the heart of the mountain. The snow grew deeper, and the path more treacherous. As they climbed, the temperature dropped further, the cold biting at their exposed skin. Despite the harsh conditions, they pressed on, driven by the urgency of their quest. As twilight fell, the group reached a narrow ledge with a precarious view of the valley below. Merlin held up his staff, and its light revealed the entrance to a hidden cave partially obscured by snow and rock. The cave's entrance was flanked by ancient, weathered statues of mythical creatures, their eyes hollow and unseeing. "This is it," Merlin said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and trepidation. "The temple should be within this cave." Arthur led the way, his sword drawn and ready. The cave's interior was dimly lit by the light of Merlin's staff, revealing intricate carvings on the walls that depicted scenes of battle and sorcery. The air inside was musty and cool, carrying the scent of earth and stone. As they ventured deeper, the passage grew narrower and the air colder. Eventually, they reached a large chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it, the artifact they had been seeking, an ancient sword, its blade shimmering with an otherworldly light. Arthur approached the pedestal with reverence, his hand reaching out to grasp the hilt. As his fingers touched the sword, a sudden tremor shook the chamber. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the statues around them seemed to come alive, their stone eyes glowing with a fierce light. Merlin raised his staff, casting a protective barrier around them. "The temple is guarded by enchantments. We must be cautious." From the shadows, ethereal forms began to emerge as spectral guardians bound to protect the sword. They moved with a haunting grace, their forms shifting and shimmering as they advanced. Arthur drew his own sword, its blade gleaming with a faint glow, and prepared to face the guardians. The battle that ensued was fierce and chaotic. Arthur fought with all his strength, his movements fluid and precise as he struck down the spectral forms. Lancelot and Gawain fought bravely by his side, their swords clashing with the guardians in a rhythm of steel and shadow. Merlin's magic crackled and flared, pushing back the spectral forms with bursts of energy. Despite their best efforts, the guardians seemed endless, their numbers replenishing with each wave. Arthur's strength began to wane, and his breathing grew labored. The weight of their quest pressed heavily upon him, and he struggled to maintain his focus. In a moment of desperation, Arthur looked to Merlin. "We need to find a way to end this." Merlin, concentrating on the magical energies around them, nodded. "The enchantments are tied to the sword. If we can remove it from the pedestal, it might break the spell." Arthur nodded and, with a final, determined effort, stepped forward. He grasped the hilt of the sword and pulled it from the pedestal. As the blade came free, a brilliant light erupted from the sword, illuminating the chamber and dispelling the spectral guardians. The light subsided, and the chamber fell into an eerie silence. The sword, now in Arthur's possession, seemed to pulse with a new energy, its blade glowing brightly. The enchantments had been lifted, and the temple was still once more. Arthur, panting and exhausted, looked at the sword with a mixture of awe and relief. "We have it. Now we must return to Camelot and prepare for the battle ahead." The group made their way out of the cave, their spirits lifted by their success. The descent from the mountains was arduous but marked by a renewed sense of purpose. The ancient sword, their key to victory, was now in their hands, and with it, hope for Camelot's salvation. As they reached the base of the mountains and began their journey back to Camelot, the weight of their quest seemed lighter. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but they were no longer facing it unprepared. With the ancient sword in their possession, They had a fighting chance against the Knights of Fate and the darkness that threatened their world. Their return journey was filled with a sense of urgency and anticipation. Each step brought them closer to Camelot and the looming confrontation with Morgana and her undead army. The fate of their kingdom depended on their resolve and the power of the ancient sword they now carried. And so, the quest continued, the road ahead illuminated by the hope that, with courage and determination, they might yet turn the tide of fate in their favor.